Imagine, demand and build a world transformed.
Welcome everyone to Labour 2024 Maintaining a Radical Horizon, which is promising to be a really interesting and certainly very timely discussion today. My name is Deborah Hermans and I've got the pleasure to guide you through this event. I'm based in South London, recently got elected as one of the London reps to Momentum's NCG. I've also helped organise the World Transformed since 2016 and I work for the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung in London. Before I start and give you an introduction to the topic, I just want to give a very quick shout out to TWT, who are celebrating 5 years of TWT this Thursday in 2 days. This is the 5th edition of TWT. In 2016, on the 24th of September, TWT opened its doors for the first time. So please, on Thursday, show some love to TWT on Twitter, share your favorite anecdote, and tell us why you think it's a really important project for the left. During the Labour leadership election, Keir Starmer, not that long ago, warned against the Labour Party lurching to the right and said he wanted to maintain the radicalism of the Corbyn years. The 2020 leadership election stood in stark contrast to that of 2015, when Jeremy Corbyn's opponents competed for who could denounce Labour for being too left-wing, in the strongest possible terms. By contrast, in 2020, the debate had moved on considerably. All candidates put radical economic reform at the heart of their campaigns. Keir Starmer's 10 pledges led many Labour members to believe that his leadership would not lead to a scaling back of Labour's ambitions or pivot away from progressive values. We are now 6 months into the new leadership, and it's fair to say Starmer has taken a much more cautious approach since becoming leader than he did during his campaign. It would appear that some of his pledges have now been cast aside. Only this morning, Shadow Foreign Secretary Lisa Nandy suggested in the Today programme that Labour is no longer committed to higher taxes for top earners or reversal of Tory corporation tax cuts. That was his pledge number 1. Some Labour insiders have argued it's the new leadership strategy to avoid committing to any policies for the foreseeable future. At the moment, it remains unclear what Labour policy will look like by the time of the next election in 2024. But polls show that a large majority of Labour members, let me just turn the light on. Really sorry about that. But polls show that a large majority of Labour members and voters want the party to continue supporting a radical economic agenda and progressive domestic and foreign policy reforms. The trade union movement is united in its opposition to a return of austerity, and it isn't just hardcore Corbynites or Rebecca Long-Bailey supporters who want to see Labour present a clear alternative to our neoliberal economic model. With the developing economic crisis and the climate crisis, the spectre of a new Tory assault on the working class, it's unlikely that Starmer will be able to avoid spelling out what Labour would or would not do differently for very much longer. We know you can't trick the electorate into voting for big economic change. If that really is your aim, sooner or later you're going to have to argue for it or explain your different agenda. But the direction Labour takes is not just down to one man or parliamentarians. Labour is a party of over 500,000 members, with affiliates who have a membership of many millions. It's a shame we're unable to bring our movement together at Labour Party conference this year to discuss the way forward for our party. But at next year's conference and in the coming years, Labour members will have the opportunity to have their own say. So today, we are joined by a fantastic panel of speakers from different parts of the left and the Labour movement to get this discussion going. We'll be talking about Labour's priorities for the coming years and how we can work together to ensure the party goes into the next election committed to transformative policies that address the multiple crises of our time. Before we begin, we have a few rules of engagement, which I'm sure you have heard before by this point. We want everyone to feel welcome in these spaces and for everyone's voices to be heard. So please bear this in mind when engaging with the chat or comment boxes during sessions. Please don't use inappropriate, rude, or unkind language, and please don't spam. Participants who violate these principles may be prevented from further posting in the chat or comment box. In the session, we'll be using a live transcription service called Otter. Attendees using Otter will have to follow a link and open the transcript as a separate window. The link will be shared in the chat box now by a tech volunteer. If you're having difficulties, please message the tech volunteer on the chat. And finally, TWT is free for all, but it's only made possible by the contributions of our supporters. So if you're able to, please consider supporting us at the worldtransformed.org support to help us sustain our work all year round. What a better birthday present than to join the supporters network. Okay, so now I have the pleasure to introduce tonight's fantastic speakers. First up, we'll have James Meadway, who's an economist and author. He's the former economic policy advisor to Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell. Grace Blakely, who's an economist, author of Stolen, How to Save the World from Financialization, and the host of a World to Win podcast with Tribune magazine. Hannah O'Rourke, who's the acting director of Labour Together, a network of Labour activists, and she also convened the commission that oversaw the Labour Together review of the 2019 election campaign. Then we've got Andrew Scattergett, who's the co-chair of Momentum and West Midlands FBU Regional Secretary. And finally, last but not least, Nadia Whittam, Labour MP for Nottingham East and a former care worker. We're going to hear from each of our speakers, and then we'll have a discussion and you get a chance to ask your questions. Do post them in the chat throughout and our volunteers will collect them. Okay, so I'll shut up now and I will pass on to James Meadway to hit us off. You go,
Okay.
James.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you for the invite to speak. I was going to. It's always slightly harder to sort of start the discussion off, I think, than anything else, and particularly I wanted to set a context that wasn't just about what the Labour Party is doing, because I think really any discussion of what we're doing at this point in time has to start with something far bigger than the Labour Party and far bigger than any Labour leadership, which is a sort of civilizational level event that is COVID-19. It's clear from the restrictions that Boris Johnson's announced today. It's clear from actually what the scientists are now telling us that COVID-19 isn't going away anytime soon, that this isn't something that we just sort of get rid of and then move on, much as we were, and that there's no real return at this point to a kind of pre-COVID status quo. That even with a vaccine, you're looking potentially that, certainly the early signs are not particularly promising in this, that there's no long-lasting immunity to COVID-19, that even with a vaccine, you're into a process of vaccination, revaccination, huge resource demands in that there's a requirement for monitoring, for surveillance, for various social distancing measures, and this is going to be a continual for a decent length of time. This is how we're going to live our lives, and this is what society has to look like. And then I'd also say this, that even if we manage to overcome a sort of best case scenario, we overcome COVID-19 relatively short order, that it's managed down to kind of endemic levels, and that we can get on roughly with a functioning society and economy of the kind we're used to. What we know, certainly from the last few decades, and it's very clear now from the modelling, is that epidemics and pandemics are increasing with number globally, that this is related to climate change and to environmental damage of various sorts, intensive farming being quite a striking example, and that therefore we're going to trip over more and more of these things. And I stress this because I think partly what we can't do when we're confronted by something like this pandemic is think that we can just sort of go back to what we thought before, or drag out the programs we had before and say, okay, this is still kind of applying now. I think we do have to think through what it means living in a world that faces these kind of constraints, where the consequences of climate damage and environmental damage are now unavoidable, even in sort of the global north, in relatively developed, richer countries like Britain. It is not possible for anyone to escape these things. And then to a large extent, we're having to conduct a sort of radical economic program, not just around mitigation. How do we kind of limit the future damage? How do we restrain some of the things we're doing? But also adaptation. How do we make sure that the costs that we've already created are fairly borne for all of this? And a simple example, Dido Harding, supposedly in charge of the test and trace system, talking about this moonshot test. It doesn't exist, but the moonshot test that potentially you'd have to pay for if you wanted to take one before you could go into work. I mean, it's a direct cost being placed on people before they can work. So this is what we mean by the cost of this in a fairly sort of crude fashion. And I think this also forces a shift in the kind of strategies that we might think of for how we win change in this country, or probably anywhere else. Because one of the things that's really striking about the way the crisis has played out is the way it's sort of broken up the authority of national political leadership. It's not necessarily everywhere, but certainly in this country, the way it's played out here has been rather like that, that you have a government that clearly can't get on top of this crisis for a stack of reasons that we can talk about, and then the necessity of local initiatives being taken. There are local lockdowns, there are local councils with, so fed up with the contact tracing the government provides, that they're using their own systems, the increasingly visible role, I would say, of metro mayors. Alongside that, you can see unionisation taking place. There are scatterings of local strikes. There are protests against evictions. There's a fair amount of activity occurring that is somewhat separate from what happens at a national level. So if we have a programme that starts to say, how do we adapt? How do we change what we're doing? And you can see elements of this, I think, already emerging. I think the Women's Budget Group proposals around a care-led recovery that addresses this crisis of care, this crisis of work in general, was a good one. I thought Annalisa Dodd's proposals for turning the furlough scheme into a kind of support for part-time working it is a good way to approach this, that we are going to have to change how we work and live if we're going to manage our way through this in a fair fashion for everybody. These are good emerging proposals, and that's what a programme starts to look like. Allied, I think, to a strategy where you say, actually, the really critical bits of what we want to do, if we want to change the world right now, is building up those local bases of support, is working with the dynamic of the situation, which is fragmenting, I'd say, the kind of national responses, and we can work with that at this point in time. Now, where does that leave the Labour leadership? I think the first bit on this is that, I mean, bluntly, I think, and this is in the context of Keir's speech today and everything that's happened over the last 6 months, I think we need a far more sort of transactional approach to leadership of a political party. What we had with Jeremy Corbyn was something really exceptional. I mean, he's an exceptional individual. A lot of us have known him for a long period of time. He's somebody who spent 30, 40 years on the left, very, very definite, very clear about what he was campaigning for and about what he wanted to do. And him getting into leadership meant that you could see that there was someone who had a very, very solid vision of this is what his radicalism meant. This is how he thought about the world. This is how he was going to approach it. And to a certain extent, that was over and above the way that other politicians, and I don't mean this as an insult, I just think Jeremy Corbyn is not a conventional politician, but it meant it was over and above the kind of normal political considerations you might have, that you might think, okay, we don't need to apply pressure in the same way to this leadership because we think it's going to do the right thing because there's Jeremy Corbyn. That's a slightly different relationship, and it's one that I think hundreds of thousands of people really responded to. In 2017, you might even say, a great chunk of the population really thought this was a good person to have potentially being prime minister. And it's no insult, and I don't intend it as an insult to Keir Starmer to say he's a much more conventional politician. And I think that means we have to have a sort of transactional approach to the question of political leadership. That if you're a more conventional politician, you have a political process, which is a process of calculating risks and pressures and balances and opportunities. And that we need, if we're on the left, to lay out what those forms of pressure we can apply are, what the strategies we think we can win will be. Which I think brings me on to my second point, that if we have a leadership that says, we want a broad church, we want people to be involved. And also I think there is a reasonably widespread commitment to a form of radical economic change. If you take the Labour Together report, which I'm sure Hannah can talk more about, one of its conclusions, clearest, I'd say, is that Labour's coalition holds together if it has some sort of radical economic offer built into it. That's what gels all these different parts of the country that you're trying to persuade to vote Labour. So the role for the left in that is to start to say, well, okay, this is the strategy and how we win. These are the elements you need to put in place. This is the kind of world we're now living in. Here is how you develop a radical economic strategy future that can actually win. And you phrase it like that. You don't just say we want to do this because it's good, it's necessary. It is good and necessary. You do it because this is how we win, and we're the people who have those sorts of ideas. And that is where I think you can start to apply some of the pressure and to set some of the direction and to shape some of the arguments. I mean, if we want to talk about values, I'm kind of happy to. Like, I mean, the truth is, with Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, we didn't actually say very much about policy early on. It was a lot of stuff came out in 2017 with the election, with the manifesto. But actually, we did sort of keep quiet, relatively quiet, because it's a long time to the election. You don't necessarily say that much. But if we want to have a conversation about values, and that's what Keir Starmer and the leadership want to have, I'm happy to say, OK, we'll take that and use it. If you want to talk about security, fine. Let's talk about economic security. Let's talk about getting rid of zero-hours contracts. Let's talk about universal basic income as a really good solution to the problem of security. If you want to talk about fairness, I think that means you don't have to fetishize the 5%, top 5% tax rate. That was a good idea in 2017. Maybe we want to adjust it a bit in 2024. But we do have to say we want a fairer tax system, and it's not appropriate for, in this case, the Shadow Foreign Secretary to sort of casually speculate about this sort of thing. We have to set some of these red lines, and we have to say that's what it looks like. But if we want to talk about values, and this is an empty space to talk about values, let's get ourselves into that space and say, this is what it looks like. This is what the strategy is. That's how we get there. Final point very quickly. I think there is a need to overcome some of the fragmentation and demoralization that actually understandably set in since the election, and then reinforced by the pandemic, that we've all been a bit isolated, a bit unable to talk to each other. That's kind of literally where we are. I think we have to try and overcome some of that. And I was struck by James Schneider's proposal a couple of days ago for saying, can we have a kind of national coordinating unit or centre, or whatever you might want to call it for the left? And it sounds a bit grand, but basically you get, the Socialist Campaign Group, Momentum, trade union movement, the different parts of the left in and around Labour. Can you get them to agree a bare bones common programme to offer some sort of leadership, some sort of sense that here's a bit of direction, this is where we can go with all this? It doesn't have to be a grandiose set of promises, but something that just starts to say, here's a direction, here's what the left looks like, here's how we can start to get out of the fragmentation and reassemble things a bit. And I'll finish on that point, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, James. Really interesting. I was particularly interested in the idea of finding specific places where we can sort of apply pressure. So I hope we can discuss that more later. All right. So next up, we've got Grace. Grace Blakely, are you with us? Amazing. You still have to unmute on the screen.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Good. Great. Okay, cool. Thank you so much, Debs. Thanks for that introduction. Thank you, James. Thank you to everyone at TWT who has organised this much needed, I think, centre for us to be able to debate in what can be a bit of a kind of, dark time on the internet at the moment. It's good to have this kind of space to talk. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about some of the ideas in my book, The Corona Crash, which, as you can see, I've strategically placed all around me just as this kind of like subliminal messaging. You can pre-order it now at Verso. If you just search Grace Blakely, The Corona Crash, you can pre-order it. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those ideas and how I think the left and the Labour Party need to be adapting to, what, as James said, is kind of the biggest, one of the biggest challenges that we are currently facing. I think the kind of the biggest challenge that we're facing today, being the emergence of this pandemic in the context of a set of overlapping ecological and environmental crises that fundamentally threaten our way of life, and which actually mean that it's likely that we potentially see more pandemics, more kind of extreme weather events, all sorts of strains on all of our ecological agricultural systems. The challenges that kind of historical moment generates are pretty unusual and specific. And James was kind of hinting at some of that in his talk. I think that the problem we're facing today, especially when we look at the way in which governments and, what we would ordinarily call kind of neoliberal governments are attempting to respond to that crisis, is that the narratives that we've developed, particularly over the last kind of 10 years, the narratives that were really behind the success of the left in the UK and throughout Europe, which were all around kind of austerity, which were all around this idea. And they were quite narrowly economistic arguments often, especially the ones that kind of made it into the public sphere, which was that, we had these economic arguments against austerity, which was that the state was too small. We needed to have a bigger state, which was investing in infrastructure, which was, working to boost productivity. And if we did that, then basically the argument was, it was a standard social democratic argument, that the pie would get bigger for everyone and then would be able to redistribute it. I think the challenge that we face now is that whilst we developed a critique of austerity that was kind of, coherent according to kind of basic social democratic principles, and which was a kind of economistic critique, we never really developed a critique of austerity as a class project, as a set of policies that was pursued by a ruling class that was, that has, unbelievable levels of class solidarity that puts, all other classes to shame in the ability that they're able to in their ability to have each other's backs. And austerity as a class project is really what we should have been critiquing that whole time, because now we find ourselves in this position where we have a state that is willing to spend a little bit more money to keep the economy going, that has even before the pandemic said that it's going to kind of invest in infrastructure. We have a Conservative Party that is, Rishi Sunak obviously at least partly doing this out of political convenience because he has his eye on the top job, giving things away. I went to a Spoons the other day and there was just a picture of Rishi Sunak's face in the window. And this is obviously all to do with his relation to the government's relationship with Tim Martin, the founder of Wetherspoons. But it's just, he's obviously trying to cultivate that image and is doing so relatively successfully. So the arguments that we would want to throw back around, you are not spending enough money, we need to kind of expand the size of the state if we want to kind of compete globally, if we want a successful, productive economy, etc., aren't really going to land. And I think this is indicative of something that perhaps we never really centered in our discussion and analysis of neoliberalism, of the kind of ideological apparatus that has been used by successive governments all over the world for the last 40 years. I talk a little bit in my previous book, Stolen, about how that was associated with a particular model of economic growth called kind of finance-led growth. But whenever we talk about neoliberalism, we talk about it, this was an ideology that prioritized small states, free markets, privatization, deregulation, tax cuts, etc. And that was all true to an extent, but neoliberalism was never really about creating a small state. It was about creating a captured state. And we see today what that really means, just as we saw it during the financial crisis, which is that we have governments that are quite happy to put all of their quite substantial, if you're looking at the governments in the global north, all of their resources towards saving a capitalist system that is struggling as a result of either its own excesses or a kind of external threat. And you get, as I said, this kind of staggering level of class solidarity between states, between financial institutions, big corporations and international organizations, all basically working together to use their collective resources in order to maintain the status quo. And you can see how that develops. You can see the kind of class relations, at the core of that by looking at the very clear hierarchy that's emerged in terms of who's going to get state help throughout the course of this pandemic. Because obviously, the first thing that happens is Central Banks Act to pump tons of money into the system, basically to make sure that the financial sector and the biggest businesses are safe. They want to just kind of keep everything going, keep everything flowing. So the finance sector and big businesses get access to very, very cheap money, basically. And that serves to keep them afloat, whilst also, as we've seen recently, pushing up asset prices and increasing the wealth of people at the very, very top. Then you start to see more interventions for kind of bigger businesses. So obviously the Bank of England then invents this new financing facility that's been used by lots of different corporations to help them with their financing needs. Then you see help for small businesses. So you have the the coronavirus business interruption loan scheme, otherwise known as the bounce back loans, which are offered to some small businesses. Then after that, you have help for mortgage holders. And then after that, after a huge amount of pressure, you eventually get the furlough scheme, obviously, because, Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak realised that if they don't provide some support for workers, then you're going to get a mass unemployment crisis, mass personal debt crisis, a mass evictions crisis, etc. So that support is eventually provided. But there are still lots of people who are being left out. So people on universal credit who can barely afford to make ends meet. People in the private rented sector. We're on the cusp of a massive evictions crisis. Self-employed people, for example. So all of these people are kind of are left out, and there's no thought for what's going on in the rest of the world. Obviously, we're facing the biggest global debt crisis, sovereign debt crisis that we've ever seen in history, even worse than one in the 1970s. But that's not even on anyone's radar at the moment. So there's this very clear hierarchy as to who gets access to state support, and that's obviously based, as I said, on the kind of class relationships that make up modern capitalism. And what I kind of argue in the book, and what I'm arguing in the book that I'm writing at the moment, actually, is that we're kind of living under this this system that can loosely be called something like corporatocracy, right? Where you've got a very cohesive ruling class that is made up of the world's most powerful states, some of the most powerful international institutions, big monopoly corporations, and the biggest financial institutions. And they all help and support each other in various different ways. They're all connected in various different ways. And again, the COVID-19 crisis provides us with very, very clear evidence of that. One of the most interesting stories to have come out of the kind of corporate financing facility, whatever it's called, the Bank of England CCCF program, is that EasyJet claimed about £600 million through this kind of basically central bank loan scheme, and at the same, like maybe, you know, a month or so later, it paid out a huge dividend payment to shareholders. It was also at the same time considering laying off workers and introducing pay cuts. And then we found out that 6 months earlier, the CEO of EasyJet had been in a meeting with the then Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, saying, you can tell where my mind is, saying you can't introduce any taxes like other European countries have on aviation, because doing so would basically harm our profits. So this is, you know, you can see really the kind of cartel relationships that sustain this this kind of corporatocracy. So in this context, you know, what should the left be arguing for? For me, sorry, my computer's just gone a bit dark, so I think it's about to run out of battery, but I should be fine for a few more minutes. What should the left be arguing for in this moment? For me, it seems very, very clear that arguing against a kind of, you know, this idea of a small state that isn't really that interested in intervening in the economy is not going to work, because it's quite obviously not true. The thing that we need to be calling out is corruption and collusion. And I think, you know, all the kind of political and economic turmoil we're seeing at the moment can be boiled down to two things. The first is a crisis of representation, and the second is a crisis of living standards. And I think arguing for a kind of democratic renewal helps to tackle both of those things, because people know that our economy is governed by this corrupt elite who basically don't give a shit about them, and also who they feel like they have no influence over. Most people feel like they have very little or no influence over all of the major institutions that affect their lives, whether it's the companies they work for, you know, their local government, the state, their public services, you know, even the businesses they interact with. They're just kind of loaded with bureaucracy because there are these huge, you know, monopolistic banks and businesses that you know, don't really care that much about their customers. So in all these different areas, you're seeing this crisis, as I said, of representation. People just feeling like all the people that I see on the TV, all the people that I see in my political parties, all the people I see who are supposed to represent me don't represent me. And that's really what I think we need to be arguing for. We need to be arguing for a democratic renewal. I have just been told that I've gone over time, so maybe we can open it up more in the questions. But basically, I think that means getting rid of all the kind of anti-democratic features of the nation state that exist at the moment, like the House of Lords, deepening the democratization of the state, almost like completing the kind of liberal revolution by, you know, doing things like democratizing the Bank of England, making sure that people are able to have a say in how public services are run, having socialized and democratized publicly owned railways, etc. But also extending the principles of political democracy into the realm of the economy. So really thinking about how the Labour movement, the Labour Party, social movements can work together to make sure that workers' voices, that communities' voices, that you know, the voices of stakeholders more generally can be represented in all these different institutions. And I think that really answers that real anger that people feel about knowing that they're being governed by this corrupt, out of touch and unaccountable elite. But it also gets to that sense of disempowerment that people have been made to feel after successive governments that have basically told them they're going to change everything and then completely betrayed them.
Thanks so much, Grace. And I was really interested at the end when you were sort of listing those various policies. And when we get to the discussion, I'd be really interested to find out sort of which of those you think are actually achievable under Starmer leadership, and how we can get there. So next up, we've got Hannah. Hannah O'Rourke, give it away.
Oh, thanks. Hi everyone, thanks for having me. I'm here from Labour Together. Just a quick introduction to Labour Together. We're a network of activists from across the movement, all the way from progress to momentum, and we convene spaces where we can think through like new ideas and thinking on the future of the left. So one of the things we did most recently was we conducted a review into the 2019 general election, which James, who was on earlier, was great to be on the commission for. And one of the things, as James said, that came out of that review was a broad agreement across all these different factions that Labour needs a radical economic agenda. And that there's really strong consensus for this among all the different groups that might vote for us. So one of the things that we found that in 2019, a lot of our economic policies, when taken individually, were actually incredibly popular. So things like 73% supported increasing the minimum wage to £10, 70% supported cutting carbon emissions by 2030 to zero, 66% supported tax rises for anybody earning over £80,000. And also, more interestingly, when we ask groups such as we got Data Practice to do a kind of analysis of all the different groups we'd need to win over. And some of those groups, including the kind of disillusioned older people and anti-establishment hard Brexit supporters, also kind of over 50% supported that minimum wage increase, and 42% said that they were up for a lot more redistribution. So for us, that was really, really encouraging, because it showed that there was a real appetite in the country for a radical economic agenda. And that's something that I think across the party, as James said, has sort of been accepted. The biggest thing and the biggest stumbling block for this, which again came out of our review, was that when taken as a kind of package, people were more doubtful, and also that they didn't trust us to deliver. So one of the biggest problems we're facing in the country is a real lack of trust, and that's the biggest problem that I think we've got to overcome over the next 4 years. And this is the kind of biggest question that I'm sort of thinking about, which is how do we rebuild that trust? And I think, as Deborah said at the beginning, this isn't just about the leader. It's not just about the one guy who runs our party. It's about how our party functions and operates. It's about all of us. It's about how we change our political practices. So the extent to which we're organising in our communities, the extent to which we're opening up our movement, the extent to which we're kind of reaching out to people who might not initially agree with us or might be initially distrustful. So I think it's really important that we think about how we can make the Labour Party a much more open space, and something that's open to sort of community organising and starting to build those much deeper relationships, because historically I think that's what a lot of our party was founded upon. So that's kind of one insight from our review. The other thing that came out of our review that was quite interesting was that the 2019 manifesto was slightly overloaded. So we ended up with a lot of different policies, and there was kind of a new one coming out every day, and it was quite difficult for people to understand what we were standing for, because there was so many different things coming through. So I think, again, we've got to maybe stop our kind of addiction to policy making. Sometimes we just need to figure out what our priorities are. And we need to figure out what our values are. And as James said before, I think that's a really important distinction. So having a discussion about values is really important, but policies aren't kind of the be all and end all of every part of political kind of management. I also think the other thing that is interesting to think about is the fact that there's a huge amount of time between now and 2024. The world's changing so fast. It's been changing for many years now, and the kind of scale of the challenge of things we've got to get to grips with is quite scary. So for me, the kind of most interesting line from Keir's speech today was when he said, you know, what we say at the next general election isn't written yet, but it will be rooted in Labour values. It won't sound like anything you've heard before. It will sound like the future arriving. And I think that's quite an exciting challenge, because for me, maintaining a truly radical horizon is by being open to new thinking, and not kind of committing ourselves to things that are set in stone, but continually thinking about how do we put into practice our socialist values in changing circumstances. So I think this can sometimes feel a bit scary, but there's so many interesting, amazing and brilliant ideas. I mean, I know Grace was just talking about some really interesting stuff there in terms of like how we conceive of deeper democracy, how to truly democratize our society. And I think these are things definitely worth thinking about. I mean, there's lots of work from kind of Roberto Unger on democratizing the knowledge economy, which I'm really interested in. Also kind of things around sort of interoperability as a kind of response to tech monopolies, which is again quite an interesting emerging chain of thinking. And then just generally kind of embracing maybe a more radical approach to international taxation. Like, these are all ideas that I think we're yet to write down in policy, but are still emerging. So I think we've got to be flexible enough to engage with this thinking and to keep engaging and renewing our thinking. So I think that's really important. So I guess the two things that I've talked about here is that both in terms of building trust and also in building policies for the future, both require us to change our political practice. It means us being more open to people, to building a movement that kind of is beyond just what we already have. It involves us being flexible, being able to change our minds. I think one of the biggest things is, like, if you believe that the world can change, you have to believe that people can change. So again, it's about us persuading people that Labour is the kind of party that they need to vote for. And I think also what we need is more spaces for genuine discussion about all these issues. I think at the moment our party is highly factionalized, and you've got lots of bad faith on both sides. And somehow we have to kind of overcome that to be able to at least create the space for us to have these genuinely radical discussions, and try and work out what the policies will be that put our Labour values into practice, and even have a conversation about what those Labour values are, because I think sometimes we often speak about the same thing but we're using different words. So I think that's really important, and I think TWT has actually made some really good progress on this. Like, some of the events that TWT has run over the past sort of 5 years have been an attempt to convene these spaces, and it's been about giving everybody a say and a kind of seat at the table and equal hearing. And I think the more that we can do that kind of work, the more that we can start to build the kind of movement and party that we need to be, because again, this isn't just about influencing kind of the top or the leadership. This is about us growing a movement and a party that is capable of this kind of political work. And that's what we'll need if we're going to kind of win the next general election and have a truly transformative agenda, because that doesn't just come through what you write down on a manifesto. It comes through how you've been living, breathing and practicing politics for the last 4 years. So those would be my rough thoughts. Really keen to hear what everybody else is saying, so I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, Anna. Thanks so much for joining us. And I mean, I have to say, I really agree with you on that point, that we have to know that we can change people's minds, and we have to be willing to believe that. Otherwise, sort of, what is the point? Right. So next up, our penultimate speaker is Andrew Scattergood from Momentum. Take it away, Andrew.
Thanks, Deb. And hello, everybody. And, thanks for having me and let me speak at this meeting. Now, what our priorities should be and the strategy needed should be at the forefront of everyone's mind on the left. Now, I don't think it's any exaggeration to say that we find ourselves in the midst of one of the most crucial and important times for the left in perhaps a generation, with a pandemic still raging, with public services crumbling, with mass evictions imminent, with a brutal recession looming, with a disaster Tory Brexit on the horizon, and all of this on top of 10 years of Tory austerity and attacks on our class. Now, with all of this on our minds, it is easy and forgivable to consider that the task at hand is too great, that the left, who now have limited power within the Labour Party, have missed the opportunity and must concede on the ground we won. Having everything stacked against the left is nothing new. With the election of Jeremy Corbyn, the left, and rightly so in my opinion, turned their efforts to supporting Corbyn and building party political power, influence and policy. The reality is that with all the faults of the Labour Party, it is still the best vehicle we have to bring in about rapid and long-term change. But having said that, because the majority of the active left was embedded in the Labour Party for the last 5 years, our attention has been taken away from the social and labour movements that we built and used to progress our demands for the many decades before. Now, what has become abundantly clear to me during the aftermath of the general election is the total lack of strategy and the discipline required to deliver an effective left. The left is too reactionary, taking opportunity sometimes, if presented, and not engineering the opportunities ourselves. We mobilise when our class is threatened, but often lack the long-term strategy to build political power from this. Although this has meant we have achieved some great victories, It has also meant our defeats are at times catastrophic. If we are to have a real chance of radically changing this country and securing a powerful future for the left, then we must address our ability to organise across the different movements and build sustained and ingrained power within our communities. Now, apologies for using an analogy here, but you can't build a skyscraper without solid foundations. Now, this is one of the reasons why I stood to be on Momentum's NCG. Momentum has, over the last 5 years, built a vibrant and sizable movement on the Labour left. It attracted thousands of seasoned and new Labour Party activists and built influence within the structures of the Labour Party. The question of what happens now and what the strategy should be, in my opinion, includes Momentum as a vital component. Now, the new leadership of Momentum is willing and relishing the challenge to tackle this head on. We are aiming to take that initial Corbyn enthusiasm and now reinvigorate it and rechanneling it into building power in our communities. And by doing so, building power within the Labour Party. But it's one thing saying it, it's another thing doing it. But on this, we've already started. Mass evictions, as I said, are a real threat for many right now. This is why we have launched our housing campaign this week with the aim of organising our members to support housing unions with resisting as many evictions as we can. This is about using direct action to not only assist and stand in solidarity with those in our class who are under attack, but it's also about laying out the injustices and core issues that really matter. We must be leading on the left, whether the leadership of the Labour Party comes with us or not. This is just one example of the many that the Momentum will be now taking as its direction. That doesn't mean that we will take a step back from our involvement within the Labour Party, quite the opposite, in fact.
Hi everyone, I'm not sure what's happened there. I think we've lost Andrew. He did warn me that his internet actually broke down last night. It was just getting interesting. I could try and finish his speech for him, as we do sit on the same Momentum NCG, but I don't want to do that. What I'll do instead, I will get Nadia up, and hopefully by the time Nadia's finished, Andrew will be back with us. And just to say, do please post your questions in the chat, directed at one speaker or at all of them. All right, Nadia, are you okay to have a go now? And you might still have to unmute yourself.
I am.
Nadia.
Thanks so much, Deborah. I'm like the support act until Andrew sorts himself out and comes back. Firstly, thank you so much to the TWT and to all the organisers of this event, and to everyone who's here today. And it's great to follow on from Andrew, James, Grace and Hannah, who spoke so eloquently earlier. There's so much there that I agree with and a lot to discuss. We've heard a lot over the course of this festival about the need for a radical, transformative, socialist policy platform in order to respond to the huge crises of our time, from COVID and the upcoming recession to the climate emergency and, of course, the threat posed by the global far right. All of these crises need socialist responses, and that's at a time that our socialist movement feels pretty deflated and demoralised after a devastating election defeat, which just crushed the hopes and the optimism of the Corbyn era. Look, I probably never would have become an MP if it wasn't for the Corbyn movement. I was still a teenager when I went to his first campaign rally in Nottingham, and since then I've just seen the Labour left grow exponentially. We've made so much progress as a movement, and we've built a wealth of organisations and institutions through which we can have these discussions and through which we can promote socialist ideas, from things like Momentum to alternative media like Novara, and of course the TWT itself, which I remember when it was first floated was quite controversial, and is now just a well-loved staple of the Labour conference political calendar. So where does the Labour left go from here? Well, I think the first thing to say is it's vitally important that the Labour left doesn't repeat the mistakes that much of the Labour right made during the early days of Corbynism. So the negativity, the personal attacks, the constant focusing on the past rather than looking forward into the future, that inspires no one and brings no one with us. I'd like to reflect a bit on James's comments about speaking about values and how these can be progressive. We can be talking about security and introducing, well, what really aren't that radical ideas. They're just the ideas that the times demand, I think, things like universal basic income, electoral reform. And I think it's really important that we're pitching a combination of class-based arguments and values-based arguments, and sometimes expressing one through the other. So whilst people might not understand that a working class person in Wigan, a white man in his 60s, say, has the same class interests as a young trans woman in Camden who works in the gig economy, I think there is a shared understanding of powerlessness, which is just a manifestation of a class argument. And what James says is absolutely right. We need to get into the space to have those arguments. And really that's going to be my focus as a left-wing MP and as a Socialist Campaign Group member, is supporting Keir, and also being critically supportive so that we can be selling these ideas to, I suppose, a different part of the left, I think that's fair to say, so that they can then sell those ideas to the country. The Labour Party and the movement that it was founded to represent, and other people have said this, and they're absolutely right, it's never been just about the leadership. It's about our almost 500,000 members and the over 6 million workers in trade unions. That was the case when I joined the Labour Party under Ed Miliband. It was the case under Corbyn, and it will remain the case under Starmer. I've been really enthused during the course of TWT sessions hearing members talking about advancing socialism, about CLPs making a difference in our communities, whether it's mobilising picket lines to setting up food banks or campaigning for affordable housing. And I think what all these examples show is that socialists don't have to wait for a general election or even for the next Labour conference to have an impact. Because in the face of all these attacks from the Tory government, we need to be in our communities, defending people in the here and now, and at the same time, changing hearts and minds in the process. I think a really good example of this actually is Momentum's current campaign on evictions. And I know that they're running this together with renters unions, and it's a combination of training people to know their rights and mobilising against dodgy landlords, and then the national campaign too for an eviction ban. Speaking a little bit about Labour's policies then for the next election, I think it's, as others have said, I think James said this, that it's fine, I think, that we don't have a clear policy platform yet. That means that there's everything to play for and we better get to it. But it is clear that Labour needs a clear set of policies, not just individuals to organise around. So this time last year, I was really proud. In fact, this is probably one of my happiest and proudest political achievements, was being small part, but a small part of the team that helped to get the Labour campaign for free movement motion through conference. And that motion changed Labour's approach to immigration. It put policies like closing all detention centres, ending no recourse to public funds, and giving migrants the vote on the agenda. Similarly, of course, the Green New Deal has helped shift Labour policy in a more radical direction when it comes to climate change, and to its credit has been holding the party to account ever since. Of course, this year we don't have a conference where we can campaign or pass motions, so we need to find other ways of doing that, and we don't know when we're next going to be able to have a conference. So, for example, I've been really proud to speak at John McDonnell's Claim the Future series, which I think is just a fantastic initiative. It's been bringing together socialists and Labour, civil society groups, trade unions, to really imagine and campaign for a different future. So from the end of landlordism, demanding the abolition of no recourse to public funds, the policy that leaves so many migrants destitute and homeless. I want to just mention Grace's points on the economy, because I couldn't agree more. I think we've certainly in the last 5 years shifted the ground economically when it comes to austerity. And our task now, sort of accelerated by coronavirus, is to develop this. And we started doing that in the 2019 manifesto. But as Hannah said, it felt overloaded to people. And that's not because there was, in my view, a single policy in there that shouldn't be a policy implemented by a Labour government. But I think we didn't have a narrative to tie it together. And thinking a bit more about what that should be, we don't want state capitalism. We want new forms of democratic ownership and power building and power sharing and non-hierarchical forms of decision making. So workers' control of public services, community control. For example, I think there are very strong arguments for bringing finance into public ownership. I'm really enthused by the work of the Women's Budget Group and Annalisa's commitment to a green care-led recovery, which is something that is completely been ignored by this government, which thinks of a green industrial revolution as being all about men in hard hats, when actually the care sector is 8 times less carbon intensive, creates 2 million new jobs. I'm getting a please wrap up soon, and I'm not finished, so I'm going to rush to the end. Just summing up then, I sort of agree that in some senses we're having to be more transactional because we're having to have different negotiations within the party. But as Andrew was saying, we also need to be organising outside the party. So movements like BLM, XR, which have been unconstrained by short-term electoralism, have already helped to shift public opinion. And when we look at history, we know that huge progressive transformative change has come from the streets before it was gradually and often reluctantly accepted by politicians. So my final message to people watching would be to stay, to get involved in the positive, outward-facing campaigns, to set up and support Labour campaigns like Labour Tenants United, Labour Homelessness Campaign and so on, find supportive MPs, pitch articles, organise events, pass motions in your CLP when you can. And of course, don't just focus on organising in Labour, also throw your energy into supporting grassroots campaigns, join a renters union, get active in your local union branch, join the climate movement. Because as we've already said, we can't wait for a Labour government to address the crises that we're facing, because they're happening now and we need to take them into our own hands.
Thanks so much, Nadia. Some really, really interesting points from you there. I'm going to bring in Andrew very quickly to finish his point, and then we will get to the questions. Thanks for coming back, Andrew.
Yeah, no problem, Deb. Sorry about that. The broadband decided to pack up on me. I was just explaining about the Momentum's housing campaign that Nadia just touched on, and about us using that as a way to show, support and solidarity with our class who were under this attack of eviction. But I guess the point that we're trying to do in Momentum is that we're showing that we need to be leading on the left, and whether the leadership of the Labour Party comes with us or not is entirely up to them on this one. And it's just one of many examples that Momentum will now take in with the new leadership and how we tend to approach things. But just on building an effective strategy on the left, we must develop the tactics and the tactics along with a strategy to achieve this. But it does involve as much involvement from those on the left as possible, and we recognise that. And just to touch on James Schneider's comments about a socialist coordinating committee, which James mentioned earlier, bringing the unions, a socialist campaign group, Momentum together. It's not a new idea, but I think it's right now. This would be potentially a good start for where we need to be going, but alone that would not be enough. A room of left leaders sharing expertise and developing a strategy is good, but this in itself would not deliver. And I just want to touch briefly on the lessons that the left never seem to learn. And one of these lessons is something that trade unions learn very, very quickly, and it's summed up as this: you are only as strong as your members. If you want to lead a trade dispute, if you want to win something, if you want to improve your lot in the workplace, you can't do that on your own. You have to go together and you have to bring everybody with you. And I don't think that the Labour left truly learn this. And this is something that the lessons that us in Momentum and the new leadership, we want to do. We want to involve our members at every single level. And this is how you build that movement, by involving them, making sure that they've got their say, that they help you come to the conclusions for the things that you need to do next. But I suppose also what I just wanted to touch on is that our members, Momentum members, they're also trade unions, climate activists, anti-racist activists, housing activists, but they are all Labour Party members. So I believe that Momentum is ideally placed to join up the left and be integral to the coordination that is needed. And any strategy is not going to work if the very people you're trying to unite are not included. So just very, very quickly to wrap up on how we ensure Labour stand on a socialist and transformative platform at the next election. Well, the resistance by Starmer to setting out alternatives and political solutions is in some cases being applauded by some as potentially a good strategy. And if it's not being referred to that, it's effectively saying that we're not going to know what the world is going to look like in 4 years. And I'll totally reject this, because I think there's layered crises here, from pandemics to recession to a climate emergency, and lots in between that. And we do know what certain areas of the world are going to look like in 4 years. And people out there are currently being presented by the solutions, no matter how bad they are, by the Tories. And this is something I don't think we should be positioning ourselves in. So in the last 5 years, the Labour left developed policies that would not just work in the short term, but would be effective and always relevant in the long term. The Green New Deal would begin tackling the climate emergency. Investment in public services would ensure we had a good public services for all. The advancement on workers' rights would mean people could stand up and advance their lot within the workplace. Mass house building would go a long way to addressing the housing crisis, and so on. These are policies that are popular and will be relevant in 4 years' time and beyond. And perhaps above all else, they're going to be critically needed. And if these policies and others, these policies and the others are what we need to maintain and build further support for. So to sum up, let us think what we have going for us and what we need to base any strategy on. And that is that voters didn't reject our socialist alternatives because they didn't like or understand our policies. Where we failed was to have the overarching strategy across the movement to sustain the political vehicle we need to deliver it. And that can only be rectified by building a strong coalition of the left across the party for a transformative agenda. And that's where I think we need to start. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andrew. A really, really good ending to the sort of first set of speeches. If we could bring up all of the speakers onto the screen now. Thanks so much to the ever wonderful tech volunteers of TWT. I wanted to give you all a chance to sort of respond if there was anything you wanted to respond to. Feel free to sort of raise your hand. Very traditional. If you do have a point that you wanted to make.
I tried to weave it into my comments earlier.
Go on.
No, I don't have anything to say. I tried to weave it into my opening remarks, which I guess.
I can
go on,
say
Grace.
Something. Yeah, so it was really interesting hearing what everyone had to say. I was really interested to hear, especially Hannah's presentation of some of the kind of findings in the Labour Together report. And I think that point that we got a bit addicted to policy making is true and is important. And, you know, it was the combination of having seemingly a new policy out every week and then a campaign around another policy that was translated into another thing that the leadership was supposed to be dealing with, but then lacking the kind of coherence around communicating that idea that really took away from the kind of coherence of the manifesto. So yeah, I think the bit about values is really important. I think that the trouble we often have with values, we're talking about values, is that you know, when you have a narrative that's based around shared values and the idea that, you know, we have a set of kind of common goods and common goals that we're all striving towards, it can end up sounding vacuous, right? Or at worst, you know, actively exclusionary of certain groups. And I think some of the most interesting stuff that we now know about this comes from someone called Anat Shenker-Osorio in the US. I've kind of learned a lot from her and her whole frame around messaging, which I think is obviously what a lot of us agree we need to perfect, is that you need to start with your values. So you need to start by constructing who, you know, basically what do we all have in common, right? Those are the most effective political messages for the left. It's like, we all want a stable, you know, income, a roof over our heads, a better future for our family. But these things are getting in the way. These are the problems that we have to face, whether it's, you know, climate breakdown, inequality, whatever. The thing that maybe I think we actually haven't gotten right either under Corbyn or now is that you need to coherently be able to state who is responsible for causing those problems. Otherwise, and this is what's really interesting, voters will find someone to blame. So if you as a voter hear half of a story, so half of a narratives have beginning, middle, and end. They have heroes and villains. If you hear half a story, you'll fill in the rest in your own mind. And if the half of the story is, you know, we all want a better life for our kids, but inequality is getting in the way, and you'll think, okay, what's going on there? In comes the far right. The reason that we have inequality is migrants, benefit scroungers, whatever. So I think, yeah, we need to be able to develop a little bit more of a coherent kind of class narrative about who is responsible for those problems. Now, we obviously saw some research the other day from the Tax Justice Network saying just blaming billionaires for everything doesn't quite work, which I think is legitimate. But, you know, there are very easy ways to do this, right? And I think specific examples of wrongdoing, which there are many, I've only touched on some in my talk, this kind of, you know, corporate collusion and corruption that we see so often, really brings those messages home and allows people to understand actually what's getting in the way of like all these things that we collectively want. So yeah, in terms of values and narrative, that's really what I'd kind of like to see more from Starmer at the moment.
I saw you nodding along quite a lot, Hannah. Do you want to maybe come in now?
Yeah, definitely. I think, Grace, you're really right on a lot of that stuff around the importance of a clear narrative. Like, we really are very bad at telling stories on the left. We're overly technocratic. We don't seem to be able to connect what we're saying to what people think or feel. And that's something that actually the alt-right has gotten very, very good at. And that is a huge, like, strategic challenge for us, is learning how to tell these stories better. I think you're right about the idea of having like a clear villain, or like what's the dragon we have to slay. That's really important. Like, that again, that's a kind of classic narrative technique, but not enough thinking or thought has gone into this at all for a very long time, because I think sometimes on the left we're really like self-defensive. We're like, oh, if we have all the facts right, then we can like prove that we're right about this, whereas we don't lean into the fact that we feel this is right and actually other people feel like this is right too. I think as well, a lot of the bits that haven't maybe been explored as much on the left have been about inequality of power. So we talk a lot about inequality of like material outcomes, but we rarely talk about inequality of power. And actually, if we're moving into a shifting system that's all over the place, I think inequality of power is something we really need to understand and get to grips with. So I think these are definitely areas that we need to look at. So yeah, I think, accept your points about like things being quite vague, but again, this is all like new territory that we have to work through, I think.
You go, Andrew.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in quickly on talking about this thing about policy and whether we're too focused on that, because I think that's a really important question we have to answer right now, because there is a lot of criticism on Starmer about whether he's too light on policy. I mean, my personal opinion, he's completely void of policy. He's not talking about policy, and it's almost that position that if I don't talk about policy, I can't be criticised for the policies that I produce because I don't have any. And I think the problem we've got is when we're having those conversations, so for people of us who are, you know, up and down on the roads, knocking on doors, talking to voters about this, we have nothing to say to them other than, you know, platitudes and you know, they're all about their values, a party of values, and we still don't really know what those are. So when we're talking about policy, I found really, really good with what Corbyn did was the policy could be used in any sort of situation. If you take the sort of Green New Deal, you could talk about that, about workers' rights and about the importance of Green New jobs and how you know, that had to be a just transition for workers. You could take all the different elements and you could turn them into different conversations, and you could have those conversations with people and try and explain to them why what the Tories were doing were wrong and why what Labour were offering was the best alternative. At the minute, I can't have a conversation. I can't go out into my neighbours and talk about what Labour can offer differently. All we can talk about is what's wrong with Boris Johnson and his policies, and that is all they're hearing. All they're hearing is what Tories think about things. And I heard something interesting. It was on a podcast, I believe, that that nurses and sort of healthcare workers were sort of saying that, you know, it's terrible and everything that's happening and the policies are bad and things like that. But it's not anyone's fault. Nobody saw this coming. You know, there's no alternative to this. This is how it is. And these are the kind of things we have to challenge. So I think there has to be a balance. But I think without any policy, I think we're going to struggle over the next few years.
Thanks, Andrew. Does anyone else want to come in before I go to questions?
Yeah, I think a lot of what Andrew says is right. I see less of a problem with not having a coherent policy, a coherent set of policies, because realistically that's not going to have happened during this early stage of Starmer's leadership, and particularly during the pandemic. But I think what we are missing and what we need urgently is a political project. I think that's a bit different to a set of policies, and that's what I see the role of the TWT, the Socialist Campaign Group, Love Socialism, all of the Labour campaigns, like Labour Campaign Against Homelessness, etc., as being really instrumental in doing, because I genuinely do feel optimistic that we can get into that space and make those arguments and win them.
James, do you want to come in, or?
Well, I can do. I suppose. I mean, look, I kind of agree with what's been said. I think all of that. The one that's sort of striking. There's two things. One is that we had kind of policy detached from a strategy, if you like. We just had a sort of list of things, and they didn't match up with that. How are you going to make those things happen? And primarily, you sort of want to win the election. So, how is your policy going to get you towards winning the election so you can do the things? And it kind of got slightly separated. And there's reasons why that happened, but it was not a good place to be. So, I think we need a much sharper view and strategy. And we need to say, if we want to argue from the left, I think particularly with this Labour leadership, it has to be like, these are the strategic reasons to do it. It's not just like, we think this is a nice idea, but this will appeal to these people. This is how we're going to assemble a majority. This is how we get a coalition together that will support Labour. That's one thing. The other one, very quickly, was just something Grace said about basically you can't just have a story without a hero and a villain. That you have to have somebody. You have to have sort of antagonist and protagonist and that sort of thing. I think it's completely correct. But it also, this is a policy question, because it then sets you up into saying, for example, if we say, you know, we would like to talk about businesses, we can't just go, isn't it great? Aren't businesses nice? Aren't good businesses really good? You have to say what a bad business is. And that means you actually have to start saying these are the bad businesses. And I think there's far too much wariness about getting into that sort of more antagonistic story from some parts of the party, you just want to kind of look like everything's nice and say kind of business friendly things. It's not going to work. You've got to say, these are the good businesses, we're going to encourage these ones, and these are the bad ones, whoever they might be, and we can all come up with a few examples and do that quite systematically. And that's a much more convincing policy narrative and story and all the rest of it, and just, you know, generic motherhood and apple pie, really.
I'm really interested in what James just said about the lack of strategy as opposed to policy. And I don't know whether anyone else sort of wants to come in on that, and like with concrete like propositions of how, I guess, we learned from the past 5 years in that sort of domain.
I think it's an important point, and I think that one thing to bear in mind when we're making our critique and our suggestions, or more than suggestions, but our arguments from the left, is to make them in reference to the Labour Together report, because that's the report that the leadership of the cabinet is using. That's what it's basing its political strategy on. So if there's something that you disagree with, then we need to show, and you know, I broadly agree with the thrust of that report, broadly. Yeah, I think we need to show why we think that is the wrong strategy, why this doesn't successfully unite our coalition of voters, why it strays too much into one discounted recommendation of the report and not another, for example.
Probably music to your ears, Hannah.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that report, I mean, just to kind of give you a sense of how it was written, and James will remember this, we wrote it on kind of Google Docs with everybody putting edits. And I can tell you now, we sort of had a commission of 15 people, all the way from sort of people on Progressive Strategy Board to James to the guys over at Common Knowledge who did my campaign map. And it was quite a tough, well, it wasn't too bad, actually. We dealt with differences quite well. But the purpose of that report was to kind of get everybody on the same page about what are our strategic challenges going forward, and open up the space for some discussion to be had going forward about how we address that. Like, we didn't attempt to prescribe policy, we didn't attempt to prescribe any particular direction. We just said, look, here's the problems, here's some sense of what might work going forward, and here's something we can all kind of agree on. But yeah, I think it's the idea of like referencing where you're going to that report is probably a good way of doing that, because hopefully everybody is on roughly at the same page on that from now on, which I think is at least a positive step.
I think it's a very impressive piece of analysis. And I guess the problem with it is also its strength, is that it's very open to different interpretations, which is probably why everyone agrees on it.
Yeah, that's as far as we managed to get. We basically said nothing goes into this report that the commissioners can't all agree on. And it turns out what they could agree on ran to 150 pages, but that was its limit.
Andrew, I saw you wanting to come in. I'll take you, and then I'm going to go to questions from the floor.
No, I just think it's this thing about strategy, and I just think, for me, I mean, strategy is very, very important, and you need obviously consensus on that strategy as well, which is, again, I think the left have failed to sort of achieve exactly what we're trying to achieve, and we've seen that in various different scenarios, and it perhaps comes to light at Labour Party conference. It's probably the most transparency you can see on the difference in strategies when you have the unions and the CRPs and all competing against the different things that we want to achieve, and how we about doing that. So I think strategy is very, very important, and that is where perhaps this greater coordination on the left would be very, very key to developing. My fear is that obviously as you go down that route, and the more you start talking about it, I guess it's back to sort of Hannah's point on too much policy. You start getting into too much detail on something, and that's where the argument starts, and that's where the trenches are dug, and you don't have any movement. So how you navigate that's going to be extremely, extremely difficult for the Labour left. But I think it's something we've got to try and find a way through. And amongst that strategy, once you have managed to, if you've managed to develop that strategy, you then have to think about the tactics on how you're going to deliver the certain areas of that. And it's not total rocket science, but it's something that the left fail. We spend a lot of time talking, we spend a lot of time developing, we spend a lot of time then going back and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There has to be that balance between involving your members at every stage of the debate, but also make sure that we come together as a coherent strategy. If we want any chance of having a transformative year in 2024, the left have to nail this, and we have to nail it very, very quickly.
Thanks, Andrew. So sort of leading on from that, I want to take the first question. And, you know, the reason why you were brought together tonight is that I guess the TWT team thought that you all represented sort of different strands of the left. And that being like, oh, there you go. And it being very, very important for all parts of the left to sort of talk to each other. What I want to ask you is, how can different sections of the left coordinate to ensure that the party policy that we want to see is reflected in 2024? Like, what concrete actions can we take? Who do we have to reach out to? How do we build majorities in the party for what we want to achieve? Grace, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. So I think, so both Andrew and James have mentioned this idea that James Schneider put forward about bringing together Momentum, the SCG, some of the big left unions. You know, it would be good to have some social movement activists, representatives of, you know, XR, BLM, etc. in there as well. And yeah, things like the tenants movement as well, which Momentum is obviously coordinating. There are obviously, I mean, when I think about our capacity to do that, the biggest challenges I see are not kind of structural. They're mainly based on basically people and personalities and, you know, I mean, like, if you've looked on Twitter, if you've been on Twitter ever since December, a lot of the time it's been awful. Like, people have been scratching each other's eyes out, and, like, you know, there have been huge debates between people who broadly agree on like most things. If you put two people who have had like the biggest Twitter debate you've ever seen and, like, you know, gotten to the end and they're like, they basically want to kill each other, into a pool of like the general population, and looked at the difference between those two views and everyone else's, you would be like, what the hell? But obviously, I mean, you know, you can't have a go at people for feeling very passionately and for having these debates, because obviously, you know, we've been, like, a lot of people, especially those people who are most out on the doorstep, who are out there kind of dealing with the worst of what we saw during the election campaign. They were tired and exhausted and disillusioned and disappointed, and then the coronavirus hit, and we can't have those kind of in-person conversations where you're much more likely to kind of end up, you know, coming to some agreement. So it's kind of understandable, but I also think that's a big part of what's getting in the way. And I guess, you know, I don't want to be like preachy and be like, this is how you need to behave on social media, but I think if we want to try and come together, which I think, you know, broadly we do, no one ever comes into a meeting and says the left should be less unified, but if we want to actually make that a reality, I think it comes back to some of the things the other panelists have said. So we need to really stop focusing on the past. We need to, yes, learn lessons from our defeats, but not bring up old, you know, divides and arguments. I think, you know, maybe we all on this panel represent different traditions on the left, but, like, broadly speaking, I think we've, you know, most of us have been in the same position for quite a while, which is that, like, we supported Corbyn, we want a Labour government, we want a Green New Deal, we want a bunch of the same policies. So I think focusing on the things that divides us isn't really helpful. And yeah, I think we all just need to be a bit, you know, on a personal level. I think about, like, and, you know, this is where it starts to get really airy-fairy, but I think about, like, kind of bell hooks and some of the radical feminist and like Black feminist philosophers and thinkers, and the way that they say that a lot of this transformation that we want to see in wider society starts within ourselves. And I think that's something that we need to think about and reflect on, just in terms of the way we talk about what's going on right now, the ways we talk to each other, recognizing that we're in a really profound and quite tense and difficult moment for a lot of people. How can we actually, change the way that we talk to each other, basically, and be a bit more respectful and focus on what unites us rather than what divides us?
Thanks, Grace. Does anyone else want to come in on this? James?
Well, possibly. It's just a small thing. I mean, just said we should be more transactional as regards, like, the Labour leadership. We should treat it as like this is a political sort of set of questions that we have to deal with. So we need to organise our own forces, present what we want to happen, say what the strategy is, that kind of thing. I think Grace highlights the other part, which is probably need to be a lot less transactional with each other, frankly. There is like, it's not like you have to treat absolutely everybody as a bitter enemy somewhere else in the movement, and there is a great deal of common ground out there. It can be far too easy just to say that, we're all on the same side, really. It's a classic one. Why does the left spend its time fighting? And there are like reasons why these fights happen. And some of it is because we probably don't as yet necessarily have a common strategy about what to do from here. Given where we want to get to, which, as Grace said, like, let's get Labour elected, let's have it with a sort of radical programme, as much as that we can get. How you get there isn't necessarily very clear, and I think there will be some sharp divides, but it'd be nice to think that we can do that without the scratching everybody's eyes out sort of end of it. So a bit less transactional with each other, a bit more transactional with power. There you go.
Hannah, have you got anything? Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, a couple of things just to add. I agree with a lot of what's been said by Grace and James. One of the things that helps me in kind of my work is how you structure a space. So thinking really hard about how you design spaces, and political spaces in particular. So are you giving people space to talk? People feel a lot less defensive when they feel like they've got time and space to talk. Do you sort of accept that you're on a journey with a person when you're talking to them? Are you accepting the fact that you may end up in a different place to where you've begun? And I think a lot of these things are like classic community organizing techniques, but are really, really important, which is accepting difference as well. So accepting that you're working towards a shared goal, but accepting that you will have differences between you, and that's okay. Because if you didn't have it, then you're not building a movement. Like, movements are messy, difficult. Like, the politics is the building of relationships and the building of the movement, and that is the political skill that we all need to get better at. So these are just some of the kind of things that we try to do at Labour Together, which might help if we can do more of that in our political practice.
Just wanted to say that I really strongly agree with what James, Grace, and particularly what Hannah just said, and don't need to repeat it because they've just said it, and I'm not a male MP.
I'm going to go to the next question, and I'm going to put it to you first, Nadia. It's a question from the audience. How do we go about organising momentum, socialist campaign group, trade unions into a pole around which the Labour left can coalesce, set a programme and arrive at a new strategy? And is this something already in flight?
I think this is something that's on everybody's minds, but it's not something that's already in the process of happening. And again, I hate to be the next person to go back to James Schneider's suggestion, but it was a really good one, and I think this also points towards that. I think, in fact, the TWT is probably the closest thing that we have to that space at the moment. And I think that's why it's really good that we're having this discussion now. But perhaps as an action point from this, all of us on this call, plus I guess we've sort of got a representative from everybody from those groups that were mentioned on this call. So maybe we should go away and start setting up what James was talking about, and then putting it out into our wider networks of groups that we represent.
I'm down.
Did you just start this coalition on this call? I mean, a big achievement for TWT. Andrew, do you want to come in on that question?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's something we have to consider, and I've just laid out the fact that the strategy across the left has been, not necessarily united where it needs to be. So there has to be a mechanism for us to come together to try and resolve that. I think, those certainly the groups that's mentioned within that question, I have to say, are all represented on Momentum's national coordinating group. So we already have not every single sort of left union is affiliated, not yet anyway, but we have members of the SCG sit on there. We have many of the left unions sit on there. So I think we already have that space where we are discussing these issues. And the one thing we can say is that the political priorities and the political direction that perhaps we want to go in, not necessarily by Momentum, but as in the left, I think there is definitely a united direction that we all want to travel on that. So I think these conversations, perhaps informally and perhaps unknowingly to a lot of people, are already taking place. I think to formalize these, But then I think we have to raise caution, because as we formalise something and it now becomes a body, and it now becomes a body of how accountable is that body? Who does it answer to? You know, how are those people who are selected on there? How do you involve the grassroots members? Because the one thing we've done in the Corbyn project is we've created thousands of people who are far more knowledgeable on policy now, are far more knowledgeable on their politics, have a much clearer vision of what they want and what they want to see achieved. And if you're not going to involve them, you're going to disaffiliate them. You know, they're not going to be with you and the parts of the party that we're going to need to take along with us. So I think this needs a lot of careful thought. I think, you know, for someone who sits on Momentum's new leadership, I'm open to suggestions. I'm open to conversations. We're talking to as many people as we possibly can about, you know, what we need to do. But I think with anything like this, it's not just jumping into something. It's not just going, boom, let's get a meeting together. Let's just set this out. Let's crack on. It does need that careful thought about how you actually engage with the wider left on this issue.
James?
Very quickly, although I obviously agree with Andrew in there. The issue up against, I suppose, is that we had something like this body for a while on the left, across Labour and beyond, and it was operating through the leader's office. Now that's not going to operate in the same way, right? So there's a need for something that had that function, which is, I think, probably bigger than Momentum or the Socialist Campaign Group or the trade unions. And and until we get to that point, I think there is going to be this continual sense of some fragmentation and people wandering around, and we're not particularly coordinating ourselves. So I think once we, particularly under current circumstances, I think if we can get there sooner rather than later, it'd be good. And I appreciate this is going to be a proper herding cats effort to try and get everybody to line up at once. But I think the outcome you get to on the other side is worth the effort that could be put in.
Thanks, James. Anyone else want to come in on this question? No. All right. I'll go to one last question. Takes us to a slightly different topic from the audience. Where does constitutional and electoral reform and new models of participatory democracy fit in responding to our crises of democracy, including on the political and economic terrain? I don't know if we can get that up on the screen for everyone to see, because it's quite a long question. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Anyone want to come in on that question?
I'm happy to kick us off again. As I was chatting loads about
keep it to 1 minute.
Okay, I'll be very quick. So in terms of the constitutional reforms I think we need, I kind of hinted to them earlier. I mean, and I would basically have them under the completion of the UK's bourgeois revolution, getting rid of the House of Lords. I mean, I would say getting rid of the monarchy, but that would be probably too far. So, you know, having some sort of constitutional reform to the House of Lords, along with a wider set of reforms to all the institutions that become more aloof and technocratic under neoliberalism. So I'm thinking particularly of the Bank of England, especially given the way in which Bank of England policies are kind of affecting the balance of income and wealth inequality in the country. I'm also thinking of a move towards kind of more subsidiarity. We're obviously one of the most politically centralized countries in Europe. We're also the most economically unequal, regionally unequal, in terms of the different economies that exist in the UK. That's a really, really big problem. I think the absence of any real traction that people have on local politics, on community politics, is a really significant part of that feeling like I don't have any kind of power and control over my life. Electoral reform, I mean, that's a huge one. Like, I don't even know where to begin there. I don't know how far we can go on that, given that we had that failed referendum on AV not that long ago, but it's obviously something to bear in mind. And then there's all this stuff around how we democratize and socialize ownership in the economy. And I think a lot of that has to start with re-empowering the trade union movement. It would be big it would be huge, actually, if Keir Starmer would just say, we're going to repeal the anti-union legislation. And then, you know, there are a lot of things that are like broadly, you know, social democratic stuff that you could do that would be pretty acceptable to most of the Labour Party in terms of reforming corporate governance, in terms of thinking about, like, you know, we had the National Investment Bank, right? That would go some way, especially if there was some sort of democratic structures within it, to democratizing how we allocate capital across the economy. I could go on, but I've gone over a minute. So I will suggest that you pick up a copy of my book if you would like to hear more.
Anyone else want to come in on this? Go on, Andrew.
I think for me, I mean, that the question of constitutional electoral reform is a pretty complicated one, and I think the basis for people to try and understand that is is difficult. But touching on what Grace said about empowering trade unions and talking about trade union legislation, I think that comes back to part of what the strategy needs to be around the left, because if you're going to build power, in your communities, the workplace is a key to that. And the one thing you'll find as a trade unionist is you're continuously under attack when it comes to how do you organise in the workplace, all the legislation you need to get through, all the anti-trade union laws that are around you, and pretty much it's understandable that a lot of people fail to able to organise in their workplace, but then also to try and actually fight back because everything is stacked against them to do that. So feeling powerless in the workplace is a common thing that we see across all sectors. It's only very well organised sectors, which take my sector, firefighting. We've been unionised for 100 years. So we've built all that knowledge that we need to continuously fight back. But these new areas and the different sort of insecure jobs that are up there, very, very difficult. And that's when people feel powerless and that they lose hope, and then they're therefore are unable to change things. So again, when it comes to strategy, we need to be talking about power in the workplace. We need to be talking about repealing all anti-trade union laws, not just what the Tories are putting in. They all need to go, and we need to be putting in quality workers' rights that give the power back to the workplace, and building that sort of feeling that you can actually change things, and through democratic structures, as is in a trade union, to be able to vote for strike action and vote what that action needs to be, and so on. And that's something I would be very keen to sort of see us developing on the left.
We're sort of at time. I'm going to give the three of you who haven't spoken last question 30 seconds, starting with Nadia, and then we're unfortunately going to have to wrap up. Go on, Nadia.
Okay, electoral reform. First past the post is really impeding our ability to win an election. I think that electoral reform is really important, and I'm working with the Labour campaign for electoral reform. Completely agree with Andrew and with Grace on the need to repeal all the anti-union laws, and I've been proud to work with the FEU on this since the beginning of the campaign. It's Labour Party conference decided policy for excessive conferences, so let's keep campaigning on it. In terms of how this all fits into responding to the crisis, well, I think as well as the coronavirus crisis, climate crisis, and all the other crises we've mentioned, we've also got a crisis in democracy. And I think that manifested itself largely in the Brexit vote. And if that's not enough of a reason to entrench proper democratic and localised forms of decision making and public ownership, then I don't know what it is.
Thanks, Nadia. Hannah?
Just to say, I agree with pretty much everything that's been said so far. Democracy is really important, and that's where we get into this question of inequality of power, which I think is the biggest unmet question of kind of Labour politics so far. And I think it's that question of, like, at the moment, the only way people feel like they're engaged in democracy is every 4 years in an election, and that's not good enough. And we need to think much more widely about what forms of democracy. There's participatory, there's deliberative, there's so many different practices and ways of participating and empowering people that we just aren't even beginning to look at. And I think there's been some really interesting thinking on the left from Compass and other groups on this. The other thing I'd like to say is I agree completely with Andrew's points about sort of like power in the workplace. I mean, the biggest question I always ask myself, I'm just like, what if Uber drivers had access to the algorithm that determines their work? Like, why is that not something we're asking for? Why are we not asking for that transparency? And like, these are really pertinent questions to people's sense of autonomy and control and power. So I think there's so much we can say and do on that we haven't even begun to start exploring.
Thanks, Hannah. James, you got the final word.
Oh, God. Right. Well, I mean, look, I agree with what Hannah said. I think inequality of power is a really nice way to talk about this, actually, or potentially is that the question we haven't really touched on is about big data and what we do. The coronavirus has massively accelerated and expanded the use of data in all our lives in one way or another, and it's completely depowering. You're sort of taken away from yourself, and somebody is going to try and set up systems to attempt to manage and control how you operate. There's little you can think of that's more disempowering than this. So thinking about ways that we can meaningfully bring some of that back in, and actually that is weirdly a local democracy, city democracy question. The places that have done a good job in this have been like Barcelona, Amsterdam. It's been local councils, city authorities that started to address that one. I think electoral reform we should campaign for, but it also implies a slightly different quite a seriously different electoral strategy in like how you approach the election. Once you're saying we will have electoral reform, that's a whole other question. And of course, there's a massive Scottish elephant in the room on this, which we haven't really touched on, which like one way or the other, we're going to have to find a way to deal with. I did think Keir Starmer talking about radical federalism was not a bad sort of start to thinking about this. I think it needs to be massively less wonkish than talking about radical federalism or whatever, because it doesn't necessarily mean much to people. But either we resolve this question successfully for the Labour Party, or we seriously trip over it next year. And that's a suitably bleak ending for you.
Thanks so much, James, and thanks everyone else for coming and speaking, and everyone for attending. As ever, to continue the discussions, we've set up a dedicated space in our community forum, and if you've already set up an account, you can just click the link that we're posting in the chat to find the relevant discussion thread to this event. And if you're registered for the festival, check your email for your sign-up form. And of course, you can still register for other events. I can't believe it, but there is still another week of TWT going on till Sunday. So make sure that you sort of find out about other events going on. And then finally, the obligatory shout out, please, please, please join the TWT Supporters Network. If you enjoyed this session, it will really, really help TWT put on further events like this and keep going for another 5 years and longer. Thanks everyone for joining, and good night.
View the full TWT20 program and become a supporter today to help us deliver political education all year round at theworldtransformed.org.